In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 12, where, in regards to this chapter, we will set up some preliminaries in our overall development of our second policy tool in the form of monetary policy, in which we'll do so by defining money as well as going over the money creation process through deposit creation. Where in regards to today's discussion on money, we will consider some preliminaries in order to define both money as well as the money supply, where, beginning in regards to our preliminaries, thus far in our development of policy tools, we have seen how the federal government can alter taxes, government purchases, as well as income transfers in order to restore a long-run equilibrium given a short-run equilibrium stemming from an aggregate demand shock. We're turning to our graphical representation below, real GDP on the vertical, time on the horizontal. We have our growth component to real GDP in blue and our cyclical component of real GDP in orange. We know that if the aggregate product market is in a long-run equilibrium, this is at the intersection of the cyclical and growth component to real GDP. Should there be a positive AD shock occurring into the aggregate product market, we'll be at an expansionary short-run equilibrium. The government can then use contractionary fiscal policy in order to revert us back to a long-run equilibrium. Likewise, if there's a negative AD shock in the aggregate product market leading us to a contractionary short-run equilibrium, the government can use expansionary fiscal policy to return us back to a long-run equilibrium. We now seek to do the same with the second tool that is available to the government in the form of monetary policy, where we can define monetary policy as the use of money as well as credit controls to influence macroeconomic outcomes. And in regards to our development of monetary policy, this will have us go through a couple steps, where the first will be to define money as well as go over its creation process through deposit creation, which will then allow us to examine the Federal Reserve and how they have control over the money supply, which will then lead us to examine the money market and how outcomes in the money market affect the overall aggregate product market, such that how can the Federal Reserve respond in the money market to affect outcomes in the aggregate product market given a particular AD shock, where currently our objective will be to focus on one in this chapter, that is to define money as well as go over the deposit creation process. Where, now starting with money, money overall is a tool that greatly simplifies market transactions, where we can define money as anything generally accepted as a medium of exchange, where money will fulfill three roles. The first will be that it's a medium of exchange in that it's accepted as payments for goods and services as well as for debts. The second role will be it's a store of value in that it can be held for future purchases. And the third role will be a standard of value in that it can serve as a yardstick for measuring the prices of goods and services. Where with this definition, as well as our three roles in place, some examples of what constitute money will include cash, in that it's the most common form of money, in that almost everybody in a particular economy will accept cash as a medium of exchange. It's a store of value in that cash can be held underneath your mattress or say in a bank account, and you can still get your cash at a later day from your bank account or underneath your mattress and use it for purchases of goods and services. It also fulfills the role of a standard of value in that you can use the increments of cash that you have in order to gauge the prices of goods and services that are available in the marketplace. A second example will be a checkings account. So if you go through with one of those alternatives in terms of storing your money into a bank account, you can do so in a checkings account, where through writing a check, most people in the economy will accept a check as a medium of exchange in terms of purchasing a good or service. It's a store of value in that you're holding your money in the bank account, and at any time you can go back to your bank and take your money out, or simply just write a check at a later date to a particular institution in terms of purchasing a good or service. So it's a store of value in that regards, and similar to cash, it's a standard of value in terms of the amount of cash that you have in your checkings account you can use as a gauge in terms of what the cost of other goods and services are. A third example will be a debit card, in which we can think of this as an extension of the checking account, but instead of writing checks, we are now using our plastic debit card. Or with that said, the same intuition in terms of the medium of exchange, store value, and standard of value hold true, in that it all stems from the checking account still. And once again, this is just because we are not writing checks anymore, but instead using our plastic debit card in its place, which speeds things up a little bit as well. So if those are some examples of what constitutes money, what are some examples of what does not constitute money? A common example will be credit cards, in that although it's a medium of exchange that most people in the economy will accept, it's not a final means in terms of purchasing a good or service, in that the credit card itself is a service where the good or service in question is purchased with the credit card, but then later on there's an additional transaction made to the credit card companies for using their service. Therefore, given this, it fails to fulfill this role ultimately and fails to be money as a result. Using similar intuition, we can extend this to online payment systems such as PayPal, Apple Pay, and other such mediums, in that they are a medium of exchange in which cash from checking accounts are stored onto these online payment systems, but like the credit card, they are not a final payment, in that when using an online payment system such as PayPal, the good or service in question is purchased, but then later on some sort of service fee is then applied for using the PayPal service. Therefore, it fails to fulfill this particular role of money and therefore does not constitute money. So then with this definition in place, as well as the three roles of money and some examples of money, we see that it greatly conveniences us in terms of making market transactions, where without money we would need to use barter, where barter is the direct exchange of one good for another without the use of money, where this requires the dual interest of goods among parties to work and is not very feasible as a vehicle for everyday purchases. This then in part leads us to the question of how much money does the economy have overall then as a result, given that the amount of money available will affect how consumers can make transactions and partially to wanting to avoid barter overall. Where overall then what we'll have is that if the money supply affects consumer decisions based off of affecting consumer transactions, we will have that aggregate demand is affected as well. Where how aggregate demand is affected through the size of the money supply will be our overall objective in terms of developing monetary policy. So then with that said, turning our attention now towards the money supply, in order to know how much money is available in the economy, we need to first define what is the money supply. We can define the money supply in a few different ways based off of liquidity, where we will refer to liquidity as how easily that form of money can be used to complete market transactions, where we will consider two definitions of the money supply, the first being M1 and the second being M2. Where turning our attention to M1, the M1 money supply is going to be defined as currency held by the public plus balances in transaction accounts. It is going to be the most liquid way to define the money supply in that it comprises cash and transaction accounts, where using cash, checks, and debit card are pretty straightforward in terms of making purchases of goods and services with in the marketplace. Now, moving our attention towards M2, this is going to be defined as M1 plus balances in most savings accounts as well as money market mutual funds. It is a little less liquid than M1 in that even though it comprises M1 with our inclusion of savings accounts and money market mutual funds, it's a little harder to take money from your savings account in your bank account or money in your money market mutual fund and convert that into a way that you can make transactions with. It's not to say that it's not doable, it just takes a little bit more effort than say strictly using cash, checks, as well as your debit card. So what we have then is an extra step in that the M2 money supply must be turned into the M1 money supply before it can be used to purchase goods and services with. Therefore, it's a little less liquid as a result. So then with our two definitions in place of the money supply, both M1 and M2, let us look at a graphical illustration of the two. Where on the left we have the M1 money supply, which is about 3,339 billion, in which we see it constitutes traveler's checks, transaction account balances, as well as currency in circulation, where we see that currency in circulation is close to being about half of the M1 money supply, and the other half is going to be primarily consisted of transaction account balances, and traveler's checks make up a small portion of M1 as well. Moving on to our M2 money supply, we see that it's substantially larger than our M1 money supply, being $13,208 billion, where a majority of this is going to be comprised of savings account balances, and a secondary component will be our money market mutual funds. Where overall what we see is that currency in circulation, although it made up a little bit about half of the M1 money supply, it makes up a very small component of the M2 money supply. So with this in mind, overall what we have then is that M2 is about 3 times larger than M1, where cash is around 42% of the M1 money supply, cash is around 10% of the M2 money supply, and savings is overall about 68% of the M2 money supply. So our takeaways then in terms of the money supply is that M2 is larger than M1, which we can attribute to agents wanting to hold money in interest-bearing accounts rather than having them be just strictly idle, and that cash overall is a small portion of M2. So with these two observations in mind, this then sets us up in terms of the money creation process through deposit creations via the bank, which we'll pick up with in our next video.